The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
we are now about to witness the truth.
It's the Benjamin Dixon Show.
Welcome, everyone, to the Benjamin Dixon Show. I am, of course, your host, Benjamin Dixon. It is Tuesday, January 30th, 2018. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, I'd like to begin by thanking our patrons without whom this is not possible. Become a patron today. Support independent media. Support Benjamin Dixon as I continue to grow multiple platforms and grow audiences and to create something that is useful not only for myself, but useful for other people. I've been saying, I've been arguing with people on Twitter about the effectiveness of the progressive movement. And I'm going to talk more about it today and the ineffectiveness in some ways and our shortcomings. But one of the key things that we can do is to create mechanisms through which we can promote progressive voices. And that is part of what I'm doing here at the Progressive Army. It's part of what we are doing here at the Progressive Army. And we want you to be a part of it. And you can become a part of it by supporting this show in specific, the Benjamin Dixon Show. Go to patreon.com/the BPD show. Okay, enough of commercials. I'm doing this pre-recorded podcast today because I'm super excited. My son is getting some rewards at school, first grade, his first set of awards. I don't know. They start early with this. So, I mean, I don't think I got awards until like third grade or fourth grade, but whatever. I'm excited. I'm going, and that's at 9:30 this morning. So you get the podcast early. All right. All of that being said, we want to talk about today the sanctions that Donald Trump will not implement against Russia, but more specifically than those sanctions, the underlying argument and tension between leftists, centrists, and Republicans, right? And where there's overlap, but particularly where there's criticisms from the left or from the libertarian right. I want to talk about that. And then also want to talk about the Nunes Memo, as well as close out talking about progressivism and our shortcomings and where we are failing and where we honestly, as progressives, are starting to repeat the same mistakes that we've done historically, and we have to break free from it. And I think yesterday's podcast is emblematic, or rather the response to yesterday's podcast is emblematic of the problem. That's coming up at the end, so make sure you stay tuned in.
Congress, I thought they were fighting with each other. I thought they were bitter enemies, and I guess when they're who pulls the strings and who has the power and the influence, probably very much is. But when it comes to where our troops are and what they're doing and how they're financed and then putting on sanctions, all of a sudden everybody folds. Republicans and Democrats together. It's bipartisan, and that's why I strongly believe there is the existence of the deep state. Otherwise, how could you get that many people to come and agree on such a horrible policy?
This is former Senator Ron Paul speaking on his show, the Ron Paul Liberty Report, back in June of 2017. And he was referring to the Russian sanctions that were just passed overwhelmingly by the Senate, 98-2, and by the House of Representatives, which was like 4, I forgot the exact number, but only 3 people voted against it. So 400 some odd Congress people voted for it and 3 voted against this. And this is not an appeal to the masses, saying that because so many people voted for it that it must be right. But what it is just to highlight this intersection that you have between leftist circles, right-leaning libertarians, and civil libertarians who view any action by the United States on the international stage generally as wrong. And there has become a shorthand analysis, and I don't really care about the libertarian circles, but on the left, there's a shorthand analysis that we've spoken about where many American leftists find themselves, no matter what, they will oppose America's actions on the international stage, which ironically puts them in bed with some unsavory characters, right? If your shorthand analysis of foreign policy is if America's for it, I'm against it, then you stand a chance of being very wrong in some very critical situations. I do like what one of my followers said previously. It said, well, more often than not, Ben, the United States has been wrong on the international stage. And so it's a good gamble to make that assumption. And I would say it is a good gamble to make that assumption because America has done some tremendously horrible things on the international stage and undermined the idea of human rights, undermine the idea of international law. But we still cannot allow ourselves to create a shorthand that if America is for it, then we must be against it, because that is wrong. That is going to put us in the wrong category. And this particular situation with Russia, Donald Trump and the State Department, Donald Trump's State Department yesterday announced that he will not be implementing the sanctions that he signed into law after this overwhelming passage by the House and by the Senate. He signed it into law, but reluctantly so. He originally opposed signing it, but he saw that there was a veto-proof majority in both the House and the Senate, and so he signed it into law. And on yesterday, he announced through his State Department's spokesperson that he was not going to implement it. Donald Trump said this, quote, "By limiting the executive's flexibility, this bill makes it harder for the United States to strike good deals for the American people, and it would drive China, Russia, and North Korea much closer together," he said in a statement. This is all set into motion by a spokesperson from the State Department, Heather Nauert, and she said, since the enactment of the CATSA legislation, that is the sanctions legislation, we estimate that the foreign governments have abandoned planned or announced purchases of several $1 billion in Russian defense acquisitions. And the spokesperson, according to The Hill, the spokesperson said Monday that some of the senior-most State Department officials and other U.S. authorities have privately and publicly dangled the threat of sanctions over both foreign governments and other entities for their dealings with Russia entities. And so essentially the excuse is that everything's under control. Everything's under control. There's no need for any further sanctions against Russia. And the president is opting not to implement these sanctions, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of Congress, House, and the Senate says no, these sanctions need to be put in place. The irony of it is, well, actually, before I get to the irony of it, I want to take a step back and look at the criticisms of these sanctions. And I want to juxtapose those criticisms up against what Donald Trump is actually saying. If you look, Donald Trump has let me parse it a little bit better. A real leftist critique or anti-American imperialism critique would be inclusive of both North Korea, of all three, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and saying that we should not be sanctioning any of them. But this is not what Donald Trump is saying. Donald Trump is saying that we should not be sanctioning Russia. And I think that that's important to illuminate for leftists, because the president of the United States, let's be clear, he is not an anti-imperialist. The president of the United States is not anti-interventionist. The president of the United States is just anti-Iran, anti-Islam, anti-Middle East, North African nations, and anti-brown people. And so this is an occasion where he is opposing sanctions, or he's unwilling to implement sanctions against Russia, not for the sake of anti-imperialism, because he's going to carry out American imperialism in the Middle East, North African nations. And so it's vitally critical that we understand the difference between the motives and the motivations of what the president is doing and our position in general as anti-imperialist. And so when I see people championing, and when I say people, I'm referring to some key voices with platforms who generally get mistaken for being the left, but they're more civil libertarians than anything else. But they get mixed in with leftists because they fall on the right side of several arguments. And, they take up a position of opposition towards anyone who supports these sanctions because of, America is bad. And it puts them in a position of supporting Donald Trump on this. And it's not so much about them supporting Donald Trump on this, because that's neither here nor there, but it's the disingenuousness of the position overall, when this is not about opposition to these sanctions. It's not about anti-imperialism. It's about anti-sanctions on Russia. It's about not putting sanctions on Russia, nothing less, nothing more, because the sanctions he's going to implement the sanctions against Iran. So we have to make sure that we're not falling into this erroneous trope that's being forwarded by conservatives and libertarians that Trump is anti-war and that this is the anti-war position. And this is not even really being pushed by mainstream conservatives. This is being pushed more by those people who want us to find some solidarity with the alt-right. This is being pushed by people who are generally just contrarian, and then being pushed by people who are anti-American imperialism. But there's a big gaping hole in this. This move by Trump is not anti-imperialist. This move by Trump is pro-Russia. And I think we have to be careful to make sure that we understand the difference between the two, even if it has the veneer and the hint of anti-American imperialism. Donald Trump is an imperialist. And if that's the position of your critique, if that's your standard position in any critique of any analysis of the United States, then it must be sober about what Donald Trump is doing with these sanctions. Now, I'm going to go up a little bit, a level higher, and get back to the overall argument that I began the episode with, is that every state actor, every nation state in this global anarchical system is seeking power. Every single one of them would tend towards empire. And I find it fascinating, even those of my friends who are anti-imperialist, and I find it fascinating that we find ourselves supporting regimes that are just as imperialistic as the United States of America. They are just on the downside of their curve, of their power curve. That's it. Russia is not anti-imperialist. Russia is an empire. Russia was an empire. Vladimir Putin seeks to assert his authority globally. This is 100% about the power moves that Vladimir Putin has been making. And perhaps you're saying, well, in order for us to combat the United States empire, we must strengthen another empire. Then I'm just, that I'm not on board with that. Right? Because there is no benevolent empire. There is no such thing as an empire that's going to do good by all people. The empire is going to do good for itself and by itself. Right? It's going to do things to maintain its power, just like the United States is currently doing. And so this idea that there is, I don't even, honestly, now this may be my problem. This may be a place where I am too jaded and I am particular. This may be where my bias comes in, but I am not convinced that human society can exist without a hegemonic power. I'm not convinced that we will ever have a post-imperialistic society. We can easily have a post-American empire. That's not a problem. I think that's going to happen inevitably over time. But there are plenty of other burgeoning empires ready to take the reins as soon as America falls. And not so much in a apocalyptic sense, but in the sense of when America power wanes, you're going to have the vultures, the emerging vultures of empire surrounding America, waiting for their opportunity to assert global hegemony. Period. And so I bring this into context because I think that the frustration that I have, and I'll say it again, I'm not convinced that we will have a post-imperialistic society in the sense that we can have global order without empire. I'm not convinced. Maybe we can have global order with multiple hegemonic powers, regional hegemons, the block of great powers versus one giant hegemony, overarching the entire globe like the United States does. There are alternatives to it, but there will not be a time where you don't have dominating and competing. And the key word is competing, dominating and competing, global powers seeking to get the advantage over the other. It's the anarchical society that Hedley Bull wrote about. And because of the nature of our system, because there is no overarching authority, that keeps the United States in check, that keeps Russia in check, that keeps China in check. This is also written about by Kenneth Waltz in Theory of International Politics, because of this anarchy that is on the international stage, meaning basically that there is no overarching authority that has the ability to keep everyone in check. Every nation state is going to seek power. And in their pursuit of seeking power, you're going to get exactly what we have today. The United States intervening in Ukraine, Russia annexing Ukraine, Russia getting sanctioned by the United States, Russia intervening in the United States elections, the United States intervening in everybody's elections. This is the nature of our system. And I bring this to the conversation because I think it's important that if we stop our analysis at anti-American imperialism, it's incomplete. I say this on a regular basis that we cannot stop our analysis. We cannot stop our critical analysis at the point where our biases come in. And if we have a shorthand that simply says on the international stage, the United States is wrong, then we have an incomplete analysis, and we're doing ourselves as progressives, as leftists, as human beings, we're doing a great disservice to actually finding a greater solution. Now, the solution is not because the system is what it is that we should not criticize it, we should not critique it, we should not reform it, we should not try to make it better. But what I am simply saying is that in this environment that we are in between competing powers, Russia is attempting to rebuild and reassert its empire because that is what nation states do. And that we should not look at any international actor on this stage and believe that they are benevolent or that they are anti-imperialist, because there is no such thing as an anti-imperialist nation state. A nation state, by definition, is almost, I don't want to say conclusively, but a nation state by definition in the context of this international order is absolutely imperialistic, because it must seek power to defend and protect itself and to advance its interest. And because of that, there are no noble actors on the international stage. And that's where we fall into folly as leftists if we think by shorthand that anything that the United States does is wrong by definition, because America is the dominant empire. America is the dominant empire, but there are burgeoning empires that are just waiting for their chance to do exactly what the United States does on the international stage, and for them to expand what they do in their regional hegemony, in their regional sphere of influence. And so that's why we can't stop our analysis simply at the United States wants to impose sanctions on Russia because the Democrats and war hawks in the Republican Party, they just want to wage war. If that's the end of your analysis, then your analysis is incomplete. But I mean, that's pretty much just how we do it, though, right? That's generally the stopping point.
A very sad day, I think, in the history of this committee. As I said to my committee colleagues during this hearing, sadly, we can fully expect that the President of the United States will not put the national interest over his own personal interest. But it is a sad day indeed when that is also true of our own committee, because today this committee voted to put the President's personal interest, perhaps their own political interest, above the national interest, in denying themselves even the ability to hear from the Department and the FBI.
That was the voice of Representative Adam Schiff. He is the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. And on yesterday, he had a press conference announcing his dismay and his concern about the move of the House Intelligence Committee to release the Nunes Memo. But first, let me give you some background before I go into it. The Nunes Memo is ostensibly this memo that proves misconduct by the FBI and the Department of Justice. And this memo was written by Devin Nunes' team, his staff. Devin Nunes is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He is a Republican. He was on the Trump transition team. He at one point recused himself from the Russia investigation because of his folly, because of his closeness and proximity to the President of the United States and his complete inability to be objective in his role. Since then, he has reinserted himself into the conversation with this memo, and this memo ostensibly is this damning piece of evidence. I think Sebastian Gorka called it 100 times worse than Watergate. So they are hyping this up. They, being conservatives, are hyping this up to be the flashpoint of the end of this investigation into collusion with Russia, and to prove the deep state is out to get Donald Trump. So they have used this memo, and now use this memo as a muse almost to forward their interests. And the President of the United States is going to get the final say on what specifically gets released. But the House Intelligence Committee voted to release the Nunes Memo, and they voted against releasing the corresponding Democratic memo that was penned by Adam Schiff and his team, which was based, Schiff's memo, the Democratic memo, is based on actual analysis of the underlying intelligence. The Nunes Memo is not. And even worse, the Nunes Memo, they're not giving the FBI, the Department of Justice, the opportunity to respond, review, and to give commentary. They are just releasing an unverified collection of accusations into the public for the purposes of undermining the investigation into Russia. And this goes to show you the extent to which Republicans are willing to burn this entire house down in order to defend their power. And at first I was going to say that it's in order to defend Donald Trump, which I'm sure some people are doing this for loyalty to Donald Trump, but it doesn't make sense for the Republican Party to go this far with Donald Trump, except for it was in their own interest separate from Donald Trump. And so in this case, like Schiff mentioned in that clip, that they're actually not only putting the president's well-being and his interest above the American interest, the Republicans are putting their own interest above the American interest in this, because that's the only logical conclusion. They're not doing this simply for Donald Trump. They're doing this to protect the Republican Party, which begs the question, what are they protecting themselves from?
It was disclosed to the minority today for the first time that the majority has evidently opened an investigation of the FBI and an investigation of the Department of Justice. Under our committee rules, of course, that has to be the product of consultation with the minority, but we learned about that for the first time here today. Now, it has been publicly reported from time to time that there was a subset of the majority working on some kind of a investigation or inquiry into the Department of Justice and FBI, but apparently the chairman made it formal today. According to the majority, the FBI is under investigation, and so is the Department of Justice.
Just think about that. Think about the fact that the Republican Party, who is in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House, the Republican Party, which has the authority to appoint all of the leadership at the Department of Justice, it appoints all of the most of the leadership at the FBI. That Republican Party has started an investigation into itself, essentially. This is madness on a scale that I don't think we've seen in American history, where the ruling party is investigating departments that are being headed by the ruling party in order to further foment this fear and idea of the deep state. Right. And so they've taken this concept of the deep state and they've gone to the point where now they're going to investigate themselves. And this is the quintessential kabuki theater. This is the Republican Party putting on a show for their supporters, and not only the show for the sake of a show, but the show to undermine the investigation into Russia collusion. And whether or not, this is the fascinating thing to me, right? I don't really have time for people who say, oh, there's nothing there. Okay, let the investigation finish itself and come to that conclusion. But I'm sorry, when you see a party acting like this, undermining institutions, willing to burn the entire place down for the sake of defending and protecting the president of the United States, and subsequently they must be trying to protect their own interest in this, you have to pause and ask yourself the question, why? If there's absolutely nothing there, then why are they so desperate to undermine the investigation that they're willing to create this entire charade of them investigating themselves? I mean, Donald Trump literally, they could get every answer they want simply by asking the people that they appointed, but they want to create this specter of the deep state to be something bigger than what it really is. We've talked about it ad nauseum on this show. The deep state is not a collection of mystical, magical, nefarious men draped in all black, meeting at night, the secret society. The deep state, if there is such a thing, it is the collective idea of American foreign policy, specifically, and American economic policy. It is the regime that we currently live under. This is what the deep state is. It is the collection of people who are at the Pentagon, who pass down their belief system, their institutionalized thinking. They pass it down from generation to generation to generation. And this is why these career people who've been there for 30 years, they teach their pupils, and that next generation does the exact same thing that their leaders taught them, because that's part of their training as well, is to carry on the same system. It's passed down from generation to generation to generation. And this is why the Pentagon has momentum that is not moved by whoever is in the White House. That's because the Pentagon has a way of thinking for itself. And the president of the United States generally conforms to that, because these are the career professionals and the president is just an elected position and he is not the expert. This is the momentum of the United States. They're calling the momentum of this behemoth of bureaucracy, this behemoth of positions and policies and career diplomats and career military officials. They're calling that the deep state, when in reality it's nothing more than institutionalized thinking. It is nothing more than our corporate culture for the United States. You know, this is how corporations do the same thing. You know, they have one goal, a singular solitary goal. And that's because there is a regime, an overarching regime that controls the general thinking of in our economic system. But they're investigating. They're investigating the overarching thinking of our institutional systems. They're not bright enough to actually say that, but this is what they're investigating, and they're calling it the deep state because that has some fearful connotation. This is how you stay in power and not be held accountable for the power that you hold. This is the most important thing out of everything. This is how you become the people in power and are constantly in charge. This is so dictatorial and authoritarian. It is amazing. This is, we were always at war with Eurasia. This is 1984 on a new level, except it's not a foreign power. It is looking internally and saying that the ruling power, the people who are in authority, who have the ability to appoint people at the Department of Justice and the FBI to essentially get whatever they need out of those institutions, is now investigating those institutions for what? For no other reasons than to enhance the specter of the deep state. They're willing to burn this entire thing down. And, you know, my mind actually goes to some logical conclusions. What do you do when you have one half of your voting electorate so insanely deranged about hyperpartisanship to the point where they're willing to burn everything down? It may be good for the United States that the Democratic Party doesn't have any backbone and any spine, because if the Democratic Party had a backbone and a spine and they fought against this stuff with the same intensity that the Republicans create these conspiracy theories, I'm not really sure that America could withstand that. That might be an existential threat to the existence of the United States, if you just take it to the logical conclusion, which I'm not going to go any further with that. So I got some pretty intense reactions to yesterday's podcast, in which, instead of hearing the overall message, I think people heard one thing and one thing only, that I think Bernie Sanders is too old. Personally, I think he's too old to run in 2020. That's pretty much all people heard, the people that I got responses from. And I think that's emblematic of the overall problem with progressives. And I expect more out of us, because this is, this is my side, right? If we're going to take sides, I'm a progressive, I'm a leftist, I'm a socialist. I want America to serve the masses and not the few, right? So I expect more out of our side, and I tend to give people that I team up with and expect more out of, I give them a hard time. And no difference today. I think yesterday's response to the podcast was emblematic of the exact problem with progressives, in so much as we are more focused on defending, and not everybody, but there's too many people who are more focused on defending Bernie Sanders than there is developing the bench. Who is going to replace Bernie Sanders? Who is the heir apparent? Because that's the person who needs to be in the conversation right now. For many reasons, I don't believe Bernie Sanders is going to win in 2020. If it comes down to, and I'm talking primarily in the primaries, right? And there are structural reasons. We're still fighting some of the same fights that we fought in 2016, and we haven't added solutions to those problems. The fights that we're fighting is the Democratic Party having control over one half of the voting electorate just by virtue of their longevity, by virtue of their money, by virtue of the institutions that they put in place, by virtue of all the control that families like the Clintons have over the Democratic Party, which makes it almost impossible for an outsider like Bernie Sanders to take over and win. Right? Those are all factors that we're still fighting since 2016. And none of those things that I've suggested has changed. There's not been significant change in any of those categories. And so I think Bernie Sanders is going to face a uphill battle in 2020. Is it going to be as hard as 2016? No, it should be easier than 2016. But we're still fighting against the same forces. And progressives have not done what's necessary to change that structural problem that we're up against, because we have settled for criticisms of the Democratic Party. We have settled for us being contrarian and being anti-democratic. That has been the resting place for many progressive voices with media platforms of any significance, as well as the general population on Twitter, in so much as I'm able to see and ascertain the mood of the general progressive population on Twitter, which is pretty accurate because I see and hear and participate in a number of conversations. Now, notwithstanding organizations like DSA, which I'm getting ready to join. I went to their meeting. They're doing things. They're organizing. They're growing. However, where is the mechanism? Where is the organization? Where is the infrastructure for us as progressives to simply put up somebody and just pick them? Just simply pick them like they picked Joe Kennedy III. The establishment picked Joe Kennedy III. Just pick a progressive and give them a platform and a voice so that they are immediately inserted into the national conversation and considered to be a contender for 2020. We don't have that. And because we don't have a bench that is significant, we have, people kept sending me some names. I know Ben Jealous is out there, Nina Turner. And again, like I said, I don't think Nina Turner wants to be in that, in the political arena as much as an organizing arena. And, I haven't approached her. Like I said, I was going to ask her, but I will. There's a couple names that were dropped, but none of these names mean anything. Because we as progressives, people who are in media, people who have the organizing spaces, people who have the organizations, we don't have the platform to simply, or the infrastructure to simply put them into our system and they pop out as a national contender. That's what the Democratic Party has the ability to do. And that's Joe Kennedy III. That's what they were doing with Kamala Harris. And if you don't like any of those characters, here's the problem. If we don't have an alternative voice, if we don't have someone ready to go in 2020, and everybody says it's Bernie Sanders. Okay, if we're going to put all of our stakes into Bernie Sanders, then I don't know what to tell you. What are we going to do in 2024? What are we going to do in 2024? Because we can't put all of our energy into defending the honor and pushing Bernie Sanders and not put Bernie Sanders can take care of himself. I think he's demonstrated that. He doesn't need us to go out there and defend his honor. What he needs and what we need is for all of us to create and uplift the institutions, the structures to replace the establishment. And I'm saying this with one major caveat that some of you are not going to like. Here's the major caveat. If we do not present the nation with a viable alternative, then I personally, I'm going to support whoever the Democrat is. Because enough's enough with Donald Trump. I'm sorry, the insanity that's going on. I think it should be clear cut. I think it should be clear cut that there is a significant difference. And if you don't see the difference, then I don't know what to tell you. You're caught up with some of the things that I talked about in previous segment of the show, right? You're caught up in things that I've talked about previously on other shows, talking the false equivalents that are being made. I mean, the reality that Donald Trump is focusing like a laser on hurting so many Americans. That the Democratic Party may not go above and beyond to make their situation better or their economic situation better, but they are not going to target them with a laser and make them the ire of the American community, as well as receive the brunt of his draconian policies. There are real people, real lives of people who are being hurt by this president in a way that the Democratic Party is not going to hurt them. And if we as progressives don't have a solution, a replacement, let's say America, the polling is saying that Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in America. Absolutely agree with it. I see that. But I don't know how much that translates into electoral electability when he's going to be fighting some of the same headwinds. He's going to be fighting some of the same headwinds with Tom Perez and the DNC, the remnants of the Hillary Clinton administration, all of the people who have a vested interest in just fighting against Bernie Sanders because he is Bernie Sanders, and all the unfair treatment and all the things, the rigged primaries, all the things that he faced in 2015, 2016, he's going to face in 2020. But setting that aside, if he manages to win, we're going to fight like hell to help him beat Donald Trump. No questions asked. But then what? Then what? As progressives, then what? Right? I mean, that's a big if, right? That's a big if because there's a long distance between here and there. Where is our infrastructure to be able to create national contenders with just a switch of a button? We don't have it. We don't have the media infrastructure. We don't have the MSNBC. We don't have the NPR. We don't have all these middle of the road, center right organizations, media organizations. We don't have the Center for American Politics, for American Progress, rather. We don't have any of these think tanks. We don't have any of the dark money organizations. We don't have anything that rivals, that can at all rival what the Democratic Party is able to just turn on a switch and put someone who is pleasing to Wall Street, someone who's pleasing to Big Pharma, someone who's pleasing to the establishment, and run them through. And then they become the contender. And I say this to look at us and say, man, we've got so much building to do, and we need every single one of us building. I am building beyond this show. This is why I do so many other things. This show that I talk to you in the mornings, this is no longer the extent of my work. You know, not only other shows that I'm doing, but actively making partnerships and working with people to build even larger platforms so that when we find a voice, we could just cut on a switch and expose them to 10 million people overnight. That's what I'm working on. I'm also working with locally. I'm going to be joining DSA. I met some people at the meeting that I went to, and they are not a part of DSA, but they partner with DSA, and I'm working with them to get their stories told. And there are places that we all need to be working, but I fear that we have settled on simply being anti-Democratic Party, anti-establishment, and that's no more measured or reasonable or that's as insufficient as being anti-Trump. That's what I'm looking for. Being anti-Democratic Party is as insufficient as a Democratic Party being anti-Trump, because it is actually even more insignificant, or insufficient rather, because at least the Democratic Party has the infrastructure and the mechanisms through which they can elevate someone and create electoral power. They don't do it well, but they can do it. Whereas we as progressives, we are missing that infrastructure. We're missing the think tanks. We're missing. And part of the reason is, if I dig down a little bit deeper, part of the reason is that we have so much infighting inside the progressive circles. It's like a cluster F of who's going to be most progressive. Who is the purest puritanical progressive that we can find? And then the other half of us who are not engaged in that ridiculous, no true Scotsman, the rest of us are simply satisfied with making pithy tweets and arguments against the Democratic Party. It's not enough. If we're not building the structures, if you, the listener, are not actively participating in something that is going to create a structure so that the person, whenever we do get a bench, whenever we develop that, or even better, if you're not actively getting out there and becoming the bench, see, then we're past this is no longer a spectator sport. We absolutely need all hands on deck. Either you're building to build an infrastructure, you're trying your best to build an infrastructure so that you can elevate voices. That's what I'm doing, or actively working in the communities, like the different partnerships, different organizations that are in solidarity with Democratic Socialists of America. If you're not trying to create an overarching political entity across the nation like Democratic Socialists of America, if you're not doing one of those things and all you're doing on the sideline is criticizing the Democratic Party, or if you have a media platform and all you do is criticize the Democratic Party, it's great for clicks. This is my problem. This is why my morning show is pretty limited in terms of views and clicks and podcast downloads. It's because I'm not here to simply do the easy thing of criticizing the Democratic Party or even just being anti-Trump. None of those things are sufficient. And I was listening to a podcast, and they said one of the worst things that you could do is in terms of your audience, is to challenge the biases and the preconceived notions of your audience. But that's what we do on a regular basis. And I know without a shadow of a doubt that yet the response to yesterday's podcast, even though it wasn't overwhelmingly negative, but the energy behind the negative voices and the intensity of it, I'm like, you guys missed the whole point. The whole point is not about Joe Kennedy III. It has nothing. It has nothing to do with him other than the fact that the Democratic Party can just pick someone up off their bench, cut on their machine, and boom, he's instantly a national contender. And we as progressives don't have that, nor do we have a sufficient enough bench. Keith Ellison is cool. Ben Jealous is cool. Nina Turner, they're cool. I like all of them. All of them follow me. I follow all of them. I've met them, spoken with them. I love them all very dearly, but it's got to go beyond them. It has to go beyond them in terms of who can be a viable candidate to be a contender for president in 2020. And if we're going to throw all of our eggs into the basket of Bernie Sanders, I feel like we're honestly limiting ourselves and we're stifling our growth as a progressive movement. And because if Bernie Sanders does not win the primaries, I'm going to support. There's only one person. There's only one person that I've made it clear that I will not support over Donald Trump, and that's Mark Zuckerberg. If Mark Zuckerberg is third party or in the Democratic Party as a presidential candidate, I will not support him over Donald Trump. But anybody else, I'm supporting them over Donald Trump. And it's incumbent upon us as progressives to make sure that that person that we support, that person who gets the nod from the Democratic Party, is a progressive. But unless we have the structures and the systems and the mechanisms to promote them onto the national stage and to do for a candidate what Bernie Sanders did for himself, we're not going to have a Bernie Sanders every 4 years. That's what I'm trying to say. And unless we're ready to do that in an organized, systematic manner, then we're going to fall short every single time. And we're going to get satisfied with simply being anti-Democratic Party when that's as insufficient as the Democratic Party being anti-Trump. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me this morning. I started this podcast recording before my son's award ceremony, and I had to stop and go to the award ceremony, and now I'm back to finish it. And so I want to thank you for your patience. I wanted to get this out before 9:30, but it's already 11 o'clock, so I'm going to go upload it immediately. Thanks so much to all of our patrons. Without you, this is not possible. Go to patreon.com. Buy your boy a coffee a month, and make it the unnecessarily expensive type of coffee. Make it like Starbucks, and with like $6 a month, become a patron and support what we're doing as we build this platform. I'm building, regardless of the direction of my Patreon account. It's been going down, and that's cool. It's cool because we made a lot of changes, and not everybody is cool with the changes, and that's totally fine. But you know what? I'm still building, and I'm still crafting something. I have some really big announcements that are coming up for some big moves that are being made on behalf of progressive media, giving a voice to people who normally don't have a voice. That's what we're doing, and I'm going to continue to do so. For those of you who've been with me the entire ride, thank you so much. For those of you who have jumped off the ship and whatever the case may be, hey, I still appreciate you, because you helped us get over the hump when we were in a hump before, and we'll take it from here. And those of you who've never become a patron, what's up? Patreon.com/the BPD show. My son won all kinds of awards, just like his daddy. All right, see you tomorrow.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog, join the Progressive Army, and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. It's Ben Dixon! If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.
Consider becoming a Patreon. Go to www.patreon.com/the BPD show and support the Benjamin Dixon